Welcome to This is Yoga Therapy. I'm your host, Michelle Lawrence. Join me as we venture beyond the mat into the fascinating intersections of yoga and health. Each episode brings you candid conversations with the visionary leaders and practitioners who are truly shaping this field, sharing their stories, insights, and the profound impact of yoga therapy in action. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Mark Gardett about their new book, A Necessary Joy, Yoga and the Quest for Transformation. You've got a copy there, Mark. You want to show us the beautiful cover? Yeah, amazing. And so we're going to explore in this conversation the powerful intersection of trans identity and the ancient yoga quest for the self. Of course, that's a capital S, self. Mark reminds us that yoga was born in the margins for those who didn't fit into the city centers of life. And it's really great to be here and have this conversation today with you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.
I'd love it if we can just start by having you share a bit about your story, what led you to yoga and eventually to write your book. I know there's a lot there, but just giving our listeners a bit of a taste of that.
Yeah, so I started practicing yoga in 2001, and I started actually at Holy Cow Yoga in Charleston, which I think you have been to.
Indeed.
Happy to hear that it's still there. And I got into it sort of by accident because I was on my way somewhere else and I saw the yoga studio and walked up to it and just took a 6-week class and really got into it. And I think, like a lot of people, got into the physical practice and then got deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And what led to the book was that I have this feeling about yoga that it's like a gift that someone has given you. And they hand you this beautifully wrapped gift box. And it's so great to receive this gift that you want to give it to other people, right? And so that's why a lot of people become teachers. And what I realized was that I was wanted to hand these people this gift, but I had not actually opened the box. I didn't really know what was in it. And so I thought it was really important that I know what was inside the box of yoga before I taught other people, or really to know whether I felt like I should be practicing it and what's really inside this box. And I think one of the things that happens when you open the box is that you find that there's a lot of stuff that's been thrown in there over the centuries that this has existed that wasn't necessarily part of yoga in the first place. And sort of an obvious example is spandex.
Yeah.
Spandex became part of yoga in like the 1980s and 90s when it was popular for aerobics classes, right? So I think when you're going through the box, you can sort of take spandex out and say, if you want to wear spandex, terrific, right? Maybe it's even a doorway where you can ask yourself, why do I feel like I should be wearing spandex for yoga? It's all, they're all doorways. But I could sort of take spandex aside and say that's not the heart of yoga. And even like postural practice, a lot of what we think of as postural practice became part of the practice during the Indian independence movement and Indian nationalism, and it was part of colonialism. And so some of that stuff you can sort of take aside and say, valuable practices, but is it the core of yoga? And because I'm apparently stubborn, I kept reading and I kept trying to get at what's down at the very bottom of the box. What's really what's core to yoga that can't be taken out. And what I eventually came down to was these two ideas of Abiasa and Vairagya, which is practice and non-attachment. And really, Abiasa is not so much practice as a type of practice, a commitment to keeping on doing the practice for a long period of time, to doing practice dedicated for a long time, earnestly, zealously. I mean, there are a lot of words that are used for this. And so I came to those two things and I thought, okay, here we have a kernel of what yoga really is if you really commit to practicing over a long period of time. Maybe what your practice looks like will change, but you commit to the practice. And the way that you practice is through non-attachment. And I do just want to mention non-attachment quickly because one of the things that led to me writing this book is that I argued with Patanjali for like 10 years. And every time somebody would talk about non-attachment, it was often this feeling like you're that the goal was somehow to get to you don't have any feelings, or that good things and bad things are just as equal to you and it doesn't matter. And I just really rejected that idea. And I also felt that if yoga couldn't be compatible with social justice, then it wasn't something I wanted to do. So I think we get the word attachment. We have this idea in Western psychology about attachment, secure attachment to our parents, which is absolutely a need in human existence. So you don't want to not be securely attached. So I've come to use more the word identification,
Mm.
so that non-attachment is to not identify with every passing thought and feeling. In the book, I talk about the bucking bronco, that, it's like you're tied to this bull that's, throwing you all over the place. And that non-attachment isn't not feeling the things, it's the ability to say, oh, I'm feeling a thing, and to not identify with the thing. And that opens up a whole space for a different kind of experience.
Wow, you shared a lot in there. So, you shared a bit about your moment when you were introduced to yoga, and then really a whole search, it sounds like, from that moment on to really get to what the heart of yoga is for you. Am I summarizing? And that eventually led you to the book, or maybe that was all part of the process of writing the book. I'm not sure.
I would say it's still very much a work in progress. The reason I wrote the book is that I thought that if I had had these experiences where reading or hearing about the philosophy of yoga was upsetting to me, and like I felt like it didn't work in my life, or I felt like it told me I shouldn't care about the world, I thought if I had those experiences, maybe other people also had had
Yeah.
that experience, and that maybe if I had discovered some way of living with it myself, it might help somebody else.
And I would say that you're spot on. We were just talking before this too, in the practice of yoga, we never necessarily know how someone is touched by it, whether we're teaching or sharing it through your book, right? But I'm sure there are ways that it's being received that you'll never know. And it's wonderful to hear that that was one of the reasons why you were drawn to write the book. So I'm going to see if we can dive into a little bit more about what you cover in the book. You suggest that transformation isn't just a goal we eventually reach, but a practice in itself. And so, how does the act of transforming rather than just reaching a final destination help us discover who actually are? I think that's a deep question.
It's such a good question. I'll just tell this from my own story, which is that going through the process of so-called gender transition, right? I was surprised to find a self. And I think there are a lot of people who, because of the way they were raised or whatever, really don't necessarily feel that they have a core self, or that they know what it is, or they're connected to it. And it was amazing to me that what happened was that I gave up almost everything that people think of as who I am. So my name changed, and the way I look changed, and the way people perceive me, and my roles, you know, um, everything about the way I interact in the world. I lost relationships with people who were important to me. And I have new ones. And so everything that people think this is me, the things they identify with, I had to let those go, and they changed. And what was amazing to me is that they changed, and yet here I still am. The underneath me didn't change. And so that led me to think a lot more about what is this thing underneath that doesn't change. And I looked back on my life, and it's been a longer process than that. Like when I first became a teacher, I taught writing at a community college. I was 24. I had just gotten finished with my master's degree. I was sure I knew everything, right? I had a lot of knowledge about poetry and literature and almost no knowledge about human beings. And so I went into this teaching, and all my theoretical knowledge about how to teach was sure it was useful, but in the end it just didn't work. And I got a lot of feedback that what I was doing was not working. And so in a moment like that, you have the opportunity to say, like, the worst thing that I thought could happen has happened. I totally failed, right? This thing that was so important to me, I did it very badly, and I'm still alive. Like, it didn't kill me, right? So when you start to connect with that, it didn't kill me part of yourself, right? You're able to say, okay, all these other things I thought were me, they're not me. And so you can sort of pull those threads a little bit. And I think it's really important to say that I don't think that means that none of this matters, right? And the real world isn't real and all that kind of stuff. It's real and it matters. And there is something that continues to be you, even when the worst things happen, even when your whole life changes, even when you give up everything you think is you, even when you lose all the things that our culture identifies as you, even when other people tell you that you're not you anymore, right? Somehow you're still there. And so that to me was the beginning of the discovery of, for myself, I had read for, all these texts about the true self and the eternal versus the temporary world and all those things. But that's when I really started to feel it for myself.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you a little bit more about that because I think this is really a big key to your story and its relationship to yoga philosophy. And so, like you've said, in yoga offers us the beautiful and sometimes complex concept of the unchanging self, right? The Atman, or the witness that remains steady amidst all the flux. And so, for someone navigating the profound changes of a gender transformation or a major life shift, what does this concept of an unchanging core reveal about our identity? You've already started to hint at that. And I guess to take it a step further, does it sit in conflict with our evolving selves, or is it the very thing that allows us to evolve, right?
You would keep asking these questions that are so big. Uh, I think what has developed for me out of this is a sense of I now think of this as this person. So this is this person, and it's strange and sort of paradoxical to me that experiencing some separation between what I experience as my eternal is a complicated word.
Yeah. Limitless.
The self that, as far as I so far have seen, doesn't change.
Yeah.
Underneath all the other stuff is that I've become a lot more compassionate toward my self that lives in the temporary world, because I think of that person as it's this person, and this person is the closest person to me ever in my entire life. I may not, the real me may not be this person, but this is the only person I can live in, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so now I have a much, I've developed a much easier time sitting with myself and saying, okay, person who lives in this difficult, changing, chaotic world, how you're doing, what's this feeling you're having? You seem to be really upset right now. You're angry or you're anxious or you got some sort of churning feeling. And so I have a lot more ability for self-compassion because I am aware of, at least sometimes I would say, this is not, I have not achieved 24-hour a
Of
day
course.
connection to my eternal self, but at least at times I can sit and say, what's going on for you, person who lives in this
Mm.
difficult world?
Mhm.
Why is this going on for you? How can I help? How can we get through this? How can we sit with this?
Mm.
And so it's helped me develop a lot more self-compassion, and in terms of evolving, it allows this person to evolve because there's the thing inside that's still okay. No matter what changes here, I'm still okay. And that gives me the strength
Mhm.
to be able to actually go out in the world and do what needs to be done, change as it needs to be changed, maybe hear things I don't want to hear,
Mhm.
uh, and
Mhm.
and still be fundamentally okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's comforting in a way. Mhm. Mhm. That was a really beautiful answer. I guess too, I mean, how do we move through this world without losing touch with that divine inner light, which I think is another way to say, the unchanging? And how do we protect that light while still staying open to the world's changes and movement? So maybe getting a little more practical with that example. Like, how do we practically do that? Is it a is it a process of self-study? What works for you?
I'm really glad you asked me this question because what I would say is that we don't protect the inner light, it protects us. When I have been out of touch with it is when I've gotten in relationships with people who did not value me, or when I have pursued a life that wasn't for me. So the practical part for me is actually to notice that the fragile thing is the structure I've created
Yeah.
to not let my inner light out. And I think a lot of us experience this feeling that the inner light, the inner self, is too powerful. And in fact, we're told as kids very often, you're too big, you're too perceptive, you're too honest, you're too exuberant, whatever it is. And so we create a structure of all these, I won't say false selves, but all these things we identify with or things that we have aversion to that we were taught. And it's that structure that is actually fragile. And I think when I feel protective, I'm really trying to protect that structure rather than the inner self, which
Mhm.
can't, I mean, as somebody who struggled with severe self harm for much of my life, where did that come from? That came from trying to suppress that self. And that's because the inner self is very powerful and it wants to come out. It's like, put me in the game, coach, right? It wants to be out. And it takes a lot of effort. And you learn over time. I think people who struggle with addiction learn the same thing. The self is harder to get rid of than you think it is. It will keep being there. And so the practice that I have come to is much more a practice of helping this person sit with whatever is agitating or upsetting them so that I'm not suppressing, so that I don't feel that I have to suppress. And so I think it also is about becoming aware of when do I feel that I need to suppress myself? When, in what company, in what communities, in what relationships, in what situations am I falling back onto patterns of pushing myself down?
Mm.
And sometimes that's necessary for safety. And but the practice is first of all just sitting. Uh, I don't always use the word meditation because I don't know whether I've accomplished what the Yoga Sutras describe as meditation. But I do think sitting is important and just making the effort to go internal and figure out what am I feeling? What is happening right now? What is causing this anxiety or aggravation or whatever those feelings are? And then again, is this really me? Or is this some reaction I'm having to the world?
Mm.
And so when you ask the question about protecting that inner light, it's interesting to me because I do think we have to practice to stay in touch with it. And for a lot of us, we have to practice to get in touch with it in the first place. But when you are in touch with it, it is protecting you.
Mm. Mhm. Mhm. And you link the inner light directly to freedom, the preservation of that inner light directly to freedom. And in the context of your book and the quest for the self, how do you define liberation? Like, what is liberation? What is freedom? Is it an escape from the world or a different way of being in it? I think I might know the answer, but I'd love to hear you say this.
This is such an interesting question. I mean, I would start by saying I don't think it's possible to escape the world. Maybe when you die, I don't know. None of us know the answer to that question. But as someone who has tried to not be affected by the world, and I'm knowing people and seeing people who try very hard not to be affected by the world, it just does not work. And you end up building higher and higher and higher walls around yourself. And that structure is fragile. It looks strong, but it is fragile. And liberation is the ability to actually go out in the world and be centered in yourself enough that the things that happen around you can't destroy you.
Mm.
And interesting, like I would say writing this book is sort of an example of that, because I wanted to write a book for years and I didn't, because what if people criticize it? What if I'm wrong, right? What if I read an entire book and then 2 years later I'm like, that whole thing was wrong. The whole thing was a mistake. And all of that could happen. And I think it's important that for liberation, the liberation is not the idea that nothing bad will ever happen. And I think a lot about the difference between living the life I want and living the life I choose, because there are lots of things I want. I'd love to have a big house with an art studio in it. Will I ever have that? I don't know, right? There are material considerations in doing that. But I can always, on some level, choose if I am not being controlled by unconscious motivations that I'm not aware of. And so that to me is liberation, is the ability to say, I am well aware that this could go badly. I am well aware that I could. And I think a lot of times people talk about consequences. They're afraid of consequences. They're afraid they're going to lose their job. They're afraid they're going to lose their relationships. And I think on a deeper level, they're really not afraid of those consequences. They're afraid of the feelings.
Mm.
I'm afraid to feel the grief that I would feel if I lost that relationship. I'm afraid of the anxiety about money that I would feel if I lost that job. So that's where, to me, it always comes back to yoga, because yoga is this ability. It develops the ability to sit with difficult emotions. I think there's a sense sometimes that it's a practice to make you not feel negative emotions, or that you should live in a state of feeling fine all the time or nothing affects me. But I my experience is that it's the exact opposite. It should be developing a kind of strength where you can experience negative emotions, which means you can interact with people, you can have conflict, you can have disagreement, you can make mistakes, you can fail. I could publish this book and it could go terribly, right? All of those things could happen. And liberation is the ability to choose, knowing that you can survive whatever the consequences are. So
Mm.
to know what the consequences might be, yes, if I come out as trans, I could lose relationships. And I can sit with that and decide which thing is more important to me, or decide that, I can no longer I don't have the energy to maintain the structure of pretense anymore. So I'm just going to have to let that go. Right. And that liberation is the ability to tolerate that, basically. I know it doesn't sound like a very exciting definition, but I think it is incredibly liberating to be able to tolerate difficulty.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm going to switch gears a little bit, although we're still talking about your book here. It serves as a map for many, I think, for trans folks, yoga practitioners, anyone in major life transition. And so if someone's standing at the beginning of that other path, right? The life you're choosing, I think is what you said, and one that feels deeper and truer, but perhaps more frightening, what's the first step they should take to begin their quest for authentic selfhood? What piece of advice might you be able to share from your own experience and from your own understanding that you have explored through writing your book?
I see very often these questions, often online, things like, what would you do if you had infinite money? Or what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? And I sort of feel like those are not helpful questions because I don't have infinite money and I could definitely fail, right?
Sure.
And when I first came out as trans, I saw something similar where somebody said, if you lived on a desert island by yourself, what gender would you be? It's like, well, I don't live on a desert island. I live with a bunch of other humans, right? And that affects my decision, right? And so I think it's not it's not crazy to be scared when you don't have infinite money, you could fail, and other people do affect your life, right? The political situation for trans people in particular right now is not amazing, right? So instead of asking what would you do if you couldn't fail, I would kind of say, what would you do even if you might fail?
Mhm.
What would you do even if it could go badly? What would be worth doing? In so in the graphic novel V for Vendetta, there's a somebody discovers a letter from someone who was gay, and they only had 3 months to be out and gay before they were put in a concentration camp. And the letter says, "Yes, I this was not the outcome I wanted, but I had 3 months. I had 3 months to live as myself, and for 3 months I had roses and I had love." And similarly, when I first came out, I read somebody saying, "If I could just have 1 day to live as my true self, whatever the consequences, it would be worth it." And so when people are thinking about a big transition, if you have to imagine you would never fail, if you have to imagine no one will ever misgender you, if you have to imagine that you would need infinite money or that nothing will go badly, that's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very difficult. And to me, that's really what Patanjali is teaching us. He's not really, it's not moralistic. It's not saying you should be non-attached. He's saying this is the cause of your suffering. What are you going to do about it? Right. And so I would say to people, what would you do even if you knew it was going to go not badly, but if you knew it's going to be difficult? And I think that's why, like, people talk about transgender regret, like, detransitioning and all this stuff. But compared to things that are easier to do, the regret rate is monumentally low, right? People regret having kids way more than trans people regret transitioning because there's so many barriers, right? And so anyone on a point of a transition, I think it's helpful to say, what does my what is myself telling me would be worth it, even though it's going to be hard?
Mm.
And so then if I was talking about practical advice, developing that ability to sit with difficult emotions is absolutely the most helpful thing in my opinion. And that's really the reason I tied this book to transness, is that I think for people who are in a transition like a gender transition, especially in midlife when you've already got all this other life going on, developing the ability to sit with how difficult it's going to be is probably the most powerful and useful thing you can do. And it's a thing we're not taught. I sometimes think about high school and like, I could have gone without algebra if you had taught me how to sit with my emotions. You know what I mean? Like, I could have learned algebra anytime. Uh, I have never used algebra, but I need to sit with my emotions literally every day, right?
Mhm.
So that's the first thing. And then I would also say, like, find help. And I have a therapist I've worked with for a long time. I obviously have yoga teachers. I've worked with yoga therapists. I have found communities. I mean, this work of transformation, the practicing of transformation, which requires sitting with difficult emotions, it's hard. It's really hard. And it's not just hard for trans people. It's everybody is in this position where we're having to figure out what is the life that my inner self is calling me to lead. And, I read the Bhagavad Gita and he never tells Arjuna, this is going to be easy and you're going to love it. It's going to be great. He tells him it's going to be hard. You're going to suffer and it's going to be hard. But what's worth doing anyway is where I would kind of land.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Really beautiful. And I could tell born from authentic experience. Yeah. So I typically ask this question at the end of the podcast, and you've already kind of shared quite a bit about your own ability to be with yourself and how important that is, and how yoga practice is great training for that. What other practices do you do? What keeps Mark going on a regular basis? What is, the right amount of Abiasa and Vairagya for you? And what are some of those specific things that you do in your sadhana?
I love the distinction between Abhyasa and sadhana because I feel like making the commitment to the practice over time is something that keeps happening. And the sadhana, the specific practices, at least in my experience, they changed and evolved over my life, right?
Totally.
One of the things that's very important to me is my morning routine. So I get up and I have breakfast and then I go walk outside. And for me, that's a practice of attention and
Mm,
awareness. I don't look at my phone. I try to be aware of the natural world around me, the sounds, the feelings, the sights. And that's the way I try to start my day if I can, to just allow myself to be aware and if I to as much as possible sort of quiet all this constant, as you can tell I think about things a lot, right? So the constant thinking about things, let that go by focusing more on sensory things, especially sound, and maybe I'll stop and pay specific attention to something. I have a little it's like a little magnifying glass that I can use to look at things really up close, and that can be it's just different forms of attention. So that's something I do every day if I can. And then I have a sitting practice, and the sitting practice specifically is to go inward and figure out how is this person doing today, and what's got me agitated, what's got me feeling lethargic, what am I reacting to, and again sort of pulling apart those threads internally. And depending on how I'm feeling, I use different practices. And I think this is one of the huge values of yoga therapy, as compared to going to a studio class, is you have this huge, I mean, the yoga tradition, I always call it generous because there's so many practices in the yoga tradition. And so when you know enough of those, you can say, okay, well, what I need today is really a breath practice, or what I need today is really, I'm feeling very energized and agitated. I need a hard physical practice so I can get to the point where I can sit, right?
mhm,
And so for me, the abhyasa part of it is committing to awareness, committing to be aware of myself, committing to trying to stay aware of how I'm being with myself and how I'm being in the world, right? That self study. And then the sadhana is whatever today or this week or this month I need. And sometimes it'll stay the same for years and sometimes it'll change every day. But using all those different pieces from yoga to say, you know, today I'm flighty and airy and I need some grounding, right? How are we going to do that? And so the sitting part is really about what is needed today and then doing that.
mhm, mhm. It's wonderful. Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed our conversation today, Mark, and just appreciate all that you put out there in the world and the ways in which you do. And I look forward to being around you more.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thanks again for listening. If you're interested to learn more about who we are and what we do, check us out at innerpeaceyogatherapy.com.